This looks like a job for Superman. In many ways, Superman is the barometer against which other superheroes, whether they hail from his own universe or not, are measured. Standing for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow, the Man of Steel is armed with a bafflingly wide array of superhuman abilities that allow him to deal with most any threat or problem without breaking a sweat, something he's physically incapable of doing anyway in some incarnations. But that's a story for another day, isn't it? However, there is one thing that can tax Superman and has caused him considerable stress over the years: his iconic super hair, which as it turns out is just as indestructible as he is. And that begs the question, how the hell does Superman keep his luscious locks trimmed so nicely? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we're going to cover this and many more Superman oddities in this video, right down to what Supes is hiding underneath that super underwear and the trouble this has caused film directors. And speaking of his underwear, we'll also be looking at why Superman and many other such early superheroes wore their underwear on the outside. So pull your underwear over your pants, strap a bedsheet on your back, and let's dive in, shall we?
Just before we get back to Simon diving into what Superman is hiding under that underwear and whether his luscious locks are the only thing that's super down there.
Yeah, baby, yeah!
Another thing that's abnormally super is today's sponsor, Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform designed to help you succeed online. From acquiring a domain to growing your brand to getting paid, Squarespace has you covered. So when I started today, I found out about 15 years ago as a website. I was fresh out of college with a master's in computer science and a shiny web certificate, and promptly still had to spend ages setting the website and everything up online for TIFO, including a fair amount of custom plugin design and coding for what I specifically wanted to do. But nowadays, thanks to Squarespace, all of that can be done in a fraction of the time with zero technical knowledge at all needed and a pretty incredible number of features baked into the platform. Starting with design, Squarespace has a huge number of award-winning templates, and if you want something more custom, you can use their Blueprint AI. On this one, you tell it what you do, pick a vibe, and it builds a custom site with premium design and content recommendations. So you're not starting from scratch. Every design is clean, modern, and ridiculously easy to customize. Drag and drop, tweak, and done. And once your site looks amazing, you need people to find it. That's where Squarespace's built-in SEO tools come in. They automatically optimize your site so it ranks better on Google without you needing to mess with complicated settings. No extra plugins, no coding, just smart, built-in tools to help your website get noticed. Among a slew of other features, they also let you make money directly from your website. Whether you're selling online courses, exclusive content, or memberships, Squarespace makes it super easy to monetize. You set the price, choose between a one-time fee or a subscription, and done and done. All of this is incredibly easy to do with just as incredible number of features and customizations at your fingertips, all with zero technical knowledge, helping to ensure the $80,000 or so I spent on my BS and MS in computer science has otherwise been wholly wasted in the 15 years since I graduated. Thanks, Squarespace! So if you've been putting off launching your website because it just seems like too much work or you weren't sure how to make it happen, head to squarespace.com/brainfood for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use offer code BRAINFOOD to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now let's get back to Simon discussing a topic that's sure to make his brain melt.
So the first thing we should address is that Superman as a character has undergone numerous changes over the years, and there are technically dozens of different incarnations of the last son of Krypton that we could be referring to when we say Superman, which is annoying because the powers of Superman, and by extension the levels of super durability he has displayed, have varied wildly over the almost century that he has been a comic mainstay. The apex of this being the so-called Silver Age, in which Superman was, for all intents and purposes, a god, capable of literally sneezing galaxies out of existence or firing miniature versions of himself out of his fingertips, something that rather humorously would deplete his powers temporarily after he expelled these minis. Who hasn't been there? Now, going back to his earliest days, the character himself was even completely different. The original Superman, envisioned by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, was not the crime-fighting hero from another world that we know today. Instead, they made him a bald bad guy set on ruling the world in the 1933 The Reign of Superman story. In this story, a character by the name of Bill Dunn is waiting in a soup kitchen line when Professor Ernest Smalley offers him food and new clothes in exchange for his participation in an experiment. The professor proceeds to give him a potion that makes Dunn telepathic. He then becomes a Superman and tries to take over the world. However, in the process, he kills Professor Smalley, only to discover later that his powers are temporary unless he has more potion to drink, which he can't figure out how to recreate. Ultimately, the former Superman finds himself without his powers and back in the soup kitchen line A year after writing that story, Siegel recast the character of Superman, this time making him a hero bent on righting the wrongs prominent in society at the time. They also decided to switch Superman's name from Bill Dunn to Clark Kent, after famous actors Kent Taylor and Clark Gable. And from here, the character has been sometimes very randomly evolving ever since. The inconsistency is reflected very obviously in the well-known faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. The latter statement being rather curious for an individual who could fly. But of course, when those bombastic boastings were first announced on the Adventures of Superman radio program in 1940, Superman's powers of levitation did not exist, though he was very quickly given that ability, not in the comics, but on this very show, with radio also giving us almost every other essential element of the Superman mythos, including the names of the Daily Planet, Perry White, Jimmy Olsen, the first appearance of Kryptonite, and even the first crossover between Batman and Superman. As for flight, on St. Valentine's Day of 1940, at the very start of the series' second episode entitled Clark Kent Reporter, the narrator catches listeners up on the action. Quote, "Today, as our story continues, we find him hovering with his curious power above a quiet highway in Indiana. A trolley car is just pulling up the hill, and as Superman wheels and turns in curious flight, unseen below, a man and a boy come out of the shed that serves as a waiting room. Through it all, a steady sound of wind blows in the background, placing listeners whose imaginations were attuned to the audio cues of radio up in the atmosphere alongside Superman." With the precedent of his new power set, depictions of Superman in other media soon followed in making the leap from, well, leaping to full-on flight. That said, it would still be several years before the ability of the Man of Steel to fly was solidified in the comics, with various comic incarnations after continuing to waffle on this point. Let alone any consensus as to how exactly he flies, with various explanations from a generic and vague sheer force of mental will to that, as noted by Mark Wolverton in The Science of Superman, Kryptonians have a special organ that can manipulate gravity itself. That said, when talking his luscious locks, there are some consistencies between portrayals, or you can use to establish a baseline before moving on to specifics. The most pertinent to today's video is that Superman's super durability does indeed extend to every part of his body. Poor Lois Lane. Superman's hair generally sports the same level of durability and vigor as the rest of him. Essentially, the stronger Superman is in a given story, the more unruly you can expect his hair to be. As for why Superman is so tough and resistant to harm, this again varies depending on which era of comics you're reading. The earliest Golden Age Superman comics, for example, largely hand-wave Superman's extensive list of superhuman powers and capabilities as him being an alien, with writers assuming nobody gave a big enough shit to ask what specifically about being an alien made Superman bulletproof or strong enough to shoulder press a train. So on the whole, they were a little vague on the details. Eventually, writers did begin to offer more specific explanations as to the source of Superman's fantastical powers to sate the curiosity of avarice readers. For example, in More Fun Comics number 101, released in 1944, it is revealed that Superman's home planet of Krypton has a higher gravity than Earth. Exactly how much the gravity on Krypton differs from that on Earth varies between stories, but it's generally ballparked that Krypton had gravity that is about 10 times stronger than that of Earth. Whatever the case, this comic established that as a result of being adapted for life on a planet with higher gravity, Superman's body was naturally denser and more durable than that of a human, and this was the basis of his core set of Golden Age powers. Read his super strength, speed, and durability, and that on Krypton, Superman would be no stronger than a mortal man in his weight and size due to the increased gravity. As a brief aside, it's reported that the main reason writers came up with this explanation is that they were sick of being asked by fans why the denizens of Kryptonians didn't just fly away when their planet was about to explode. You see, prior to this comic, all Kryptonians were portrayed as being as powerful as Superman, so naturally, kids reading were all kinds of confused at how an entire alien race of Supermen somehow couldn't solve an issue one Superman was able to solve in a handful of pages every other week. Back to Superman's super durability, the specific detail of him possessing far denser cellular biology than a human has remained a consistent aspect of the Superman mythos, though later comics went into far more detail about how exactly Kryptonians possessing denser physiology made them able to do things like fly or shoot lasers from their eyes. Though for fans in the 40s, this explanation wouldn't be offered until they got their hands on a copy of Action Comics number 262, released in 1960. In this comic, Superman explains to his cousin Supergirl, and also the reader, that while Krypton's heavy gravity made Kryptonians noticeably stronger when free of it, they couldn't tap into their latent, nigh unlimited potential unless also exposed to the ultrasolar rays of a yellow sun like the one found on Earth. This, of course, discounts the fact that our sun is not actually yellow at all and only appears that way from our atmosphere scattering some of its light, which is also why the sky appears blue rather than black in the daytime. In fact, in the visible spectrum, the sun is otherwise actually quite white. The same effect is why the sky itself will often also appear yellow when the sun is disappearing over the horizon, as well as why the sky and/or sun can appear more red at times during this phase of the day. As the sun is setting, more of the shorter wavelength blue is being scattered because of the decreased angle of the sun relative to you, thus the light has to pass through more atmosphere to get to you. This increased diffusion results in less of the blue wavelength being visible to you, and thus what remains appears yellow. Similarly, if it is dusty or there are a lot of larger particles in the air, this will filter out larger wavelengths, resulting in a red sky and a red sun. But listen, it's not like Superman could fly into space to see the sun isn't actually yellow. Right? In any event, Superman further elaborates that Krypton had a red sun, and that the radiation given off by this kind of star saps a Kryptonian of their powers, because, sure, why not? All details that have remained in one form or another pretty consistent for the last 60-plus years of Superman media, though with occasional variations. For example, in some comics, exposure to a red sun will slowly depower Superman, whereas in others it will instantly depower him and render him vulnerable. In some comics, Superman even has his own red solar radiation pod tucked away in the Fortress of Solitude that he can use to purposefully depower himself if he so wishes. We can only assume this is absolutely necessary before any physical rendezvous with Lois to ensure that she survives the act. In any event, as for how Superman absorbs and utilizes yellow solar radiation, this again varies, with some comics and stories getting old school with it and just hand-waving the mechanics by stating that as an alien, Superman can just absorb yellow radiation via as of yet not fully understood means and just don't worry about it. Other stories have gone in the exact opposite direction and decided to just up and create an entirely new phenomenon known as the Photoucleic Effect. First mentioned in the 1999 novella Starwind Howls, the Photoucleic Effect is described as, quote, a very specialized astronomical phenomenon that takes place when an object native to the influence of a red giant star enters the influence of a small G-type star. The novella then spends several hundred words pulling scientific-sounding space jargon out of its arse to justify why Superman can punch really, really hard. For example, at one point, the novella notes how the Photoucleic Effect causes an organism's individual cells to develop a carapace, rendering it all but invulnerable, whilst the electron of every carbon and hydrogen atom in the organism leap out one quantum level. The end result is that the organism undergoes the transformation and becomes harder, tougher, more durable, better able to navigate the changed environment in which it now finds itself. No doubt in all of this, Supes also occasionally has the need of creating a GUI interface using Visual Basic to see if he can track a killer's IP address. Perhaps the funniest thing about this supposedly scientific explanation is that it wasn't actually offered to explain Superman's powers, but his dog, Kryptos, with readers being expected to make the logical leap that whatever made Krypto super tough and smart also probably applies to Superman. Because, yeah, the Photoucleic Effect also somehow makes an individual smarter by several orders of magnitude. In Krypto's case, making him not just a very good boy, but a very, very smart boy as well. And in Superman's case, allowing him to absorb and process the masses of information required to do things like maneuver at super speed. Whatever the explanation for his ability to absorb so-called yellow solar radiation, most comics and stories note that under the light of a yellow sun, Superman's cells are supercharged to literally comical levels. The exact limits of this ability, again, vary, with some comics stating that Superman can absorb an almost infinite amount of solar radiation, and others noting that Superman has to periodically burn off the energy if he doesn't exert himself for a significant amount of time, usually by firing his heat vision into the sun or something, as you do. In fact, in some comics, Superman is able to release all of his absorbed solar radiation in a singular, potentially world-obliterating blast of energy as a last resort of sorts. In others, he's able to fly into the sun and power himself up to godlike levels, doing so in one comic for 15,000 years, to the point that he emerged a solid gold being of pure energy with unlimited power, as he of course used to make a clone of Lois Lane out of energy before flying off into the cosmos. It's comic books, everybody. One thing is consistent, though, and that has been that since the 1960s, This energy wholly sustains Superman, and that as a result, he technically doesn't need to eat, sleep, or breathe, which is probably for the best. We can only imagine what the residual cells expelled in his fecal matter would do at sewer treatment plants if accidentally exposed to sunlight. Those poor sewage workers just doing their jobs. We'll actually get to more about Superman pooping in just a bit. Now, to be clear, Superman can do all of these things, but theoretically he doesn't need to, provided there is a steady source of yellow sun energy. In fact, Superman doesn't even age when under the light of a yellow sun, and there's one comic where the Flash, while outrunning death, who in the DC universe is a skeleton wearing a black version of the Flash's outfit, the last thing the Scarlet Speedster sees while sprinting through time toward the end of the universe is Superman, alone in the cosmos, mourning the end of infinity. Now, before we move on, let's go back to super poop. As mentioned, Superman can eat and, in fact, greatly enjoys doing so, with his favorite food across multiple incarnations being a slice of apple pie made by his mother, because golly gee willikers, he's just so wholesome like that. But does he poop after? Well, maybe. The comics don't tend to go into this for some reason that we can't fathom, and while it is established that Superman's biology is similar to that of humans, save for a few extra Kryptonian organs, there is no comic we're aware of where Superman squeezes one out. This has, of course, led to multiple fan explanations for how the Man of Steel does his business, which we're going to talk about, obviously. It's this sort of crap that gets us up in the morning. So, there's one group of fans that believe Superman poops and pees like an average person, and we just never see it, because why would we? Superman is entitled to his privacy, and let's be honest, none of us want the first thing we see when opening a comic book to be the Man of Tomorrow squeezing some lemonade from the tap. Moving on to the opposite end of the poop spectrum, there are fans who believe that Superman simply doesn't need to poop, usually justifying this by arguing that his body is just so efficient that he's able to absorb and utilize all the energy from food and drink which he chooses to eat, which is why Superman is able to maintain his impressive physique despite nothing short of benching a planet being a workout for him. Among this faction, there is some disagreement about whether or not Superman would need to poop if he were exposed to radiation of a red sun, with some arguing that he would and others arguing that Kryptonian physiology would still be 100% efficient without the boost it gets from the sun. By far the most vocal camp, however, are those who argue that Superman not only needs to poop, but that he would also take appropriately sized super dumps, and in turn, no earthly toilet or pipes could ever stand a chance. Fans from this camp argue that Superman thus periodically flies into space to void his bowels directly into the sun, doing so at both super speed and with enough force to ensure the matter reaches its intended target instead of endlessly orbiting in our solar system. Others argue that Superman instead poops directly into active volcanoes, or that his super organs condense the fecal matter into a diamond-like substance that he anonymously gives to charity. Comic book fans, everybody. Getting back to Superman's durability, later comics have further established that the Man of Steel possesses a bioelectric aura, the source of which is presumed to be one of his Kryptonian-specific organs and is similarly powered and enhanced by yellow solar radiation. This bioelectric field is said to wholly encompass Superman's entire body at all times, hovering just a few millimeters above the surface of his skin. This detail was introduced to comics partly to explain why Superman's costume was never damaged during his many battles and adventures, a detail explained away in earlier comics by Superman's costume being made of super durable material from Krypton. In some comics, the material is even similarly enhanced by yellow solar radiation like he is, or in the very earliest comics by having Superman just repair it at super speed before and during each and every adventure. Versions of Superman that possess the bioelectric aura, though, do not have these issues, and some comics have gone as far to note that Superman can consciously extend it to objects in his immediate vicinity. Another detail used to sate pedantic fans asking why objects Superman is carrying don't immediately crumble to pieces due to the force being exerted upon them, or why people he rescues don't catch on fire due to air resistance, or likewise crumbled into mush by the G-forces that absolutely would be exerted on their bodies in certain instances. Something we should note is that in comics where Superman possesses this ability, his body is still described as being superhumanly dense and strong. The bioelectric aura merely enhances Superman's already prodigious strength, and that even without it, Superman would still be able to fly, among other of his gifts. And as noted, Superman's durability extends to the entirety of his body, with this perhaps being showcased best in Superman 4, in which a single strand of Superman's hair is shown as being capable of effortlessly supporting a 1,000-pound weight weight without issue. Okay, with that out of the way, how does Superman cut the hair on his head and in his other regions? Well, in the earliest days of Superman's adventures in the so-called Golden Age, the question never really came up. Like, we're sure that someone, somewhere out there, wondered how and why Superman always looked so smooth, but since they tended to play fast and loose with the law back then, writers never saw fit to answer this particular question. In short, they just simply didn't give that much of a shit. But then humanity birthed the internet, where everyone cares about literally every little thing to an extreme degree, and where we're all seeking that sweet, sweet dopamine hit that comes from arguing and being angry about a million silly things to distract ourselves from the fact that we're all going to die and be forgotten, and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. Thankfully, because we almost had our brains not fully distracted from this fact, when Superman 201 was released in 1967, it was established that Superman's hair just didn't grow on Earth, so shut up and stop asking. In this comic, it's shown that while on a planet called Moxia, which has a red sun, Superman's hair grows as if he were a regular mortal man, and he maintains his appearance with a very special spray shaver invented by the people of that world that, to quote Superman, dissolves my beard while it soothes my skin. However, as mentioned, Superman uses this while he has no powers, so it's likely that this special spray shaver would have no impact on his hair while empowered by a yellow but actually white sun. And we know this because while that 1967 comic established that Superman's hair simply doesn't grow whilst he's on Earth, there were a handful of storylines released earlier where, due to various comic shenanigans, Superman ended up with either a beard or an epic power metal mane that he had to shave off. In these comics, it's shown that regular scissors simply won't do, and rather oddly, that even Superman himself can't remove the hair without help, suggesting that Superman is paradoxically so strong that he can't hurt, well, himself. And he's definitely sporting an absolute bush down there. But in any event, Superman 139, released a few years earlier in 1960, showed exposure to red kryptonite make Superman's hair and nails grow, giving him, frankly, a pretty rad mullet. The 1960s weren't ready for mullet Superman, and the comic shows the Man of Tomorrow struggling to cut his own hair using X-ray vision. Why he didn't try his heat vision? Never explained. In any event, after a while, Superman enlists help from both Supergirl and his faithful canine companion Krypto to trim things down, which, let's just say we fear what Rule 34 would do with this one, but in any event, Supes requests that they both focus their X-ray vision at full power directly onto his cool beard to blast it directly off his face, which totally works. Following Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1980, which effectively rebooted the DC universe, this scaled back Superman's powers from his absurd peak in the Silver Age and formalized what many would recognize today as his origins. In this, writer John Byrne established during the Man of Steel miniseries that Superman's hair did indeed grow, and that he kept it in check by simply reflecting his own heat vision off a shiny piece of metal ripped from the hull of the ship that carried him to Earth. Perhaps our favorite detail revealed during the panels showing this is that Superman owns an electric razor that he has to turn on while doing this to sell the illusion that he's shaving like a normal guy rather than lasering the beard off his own face. For the most part, since the release of that comic, this is how Superman has been shown to groom in most every story in which they care to establish how the Man of Steel stays so silky smooth. Though the detail of him needing to specifically use a piece of the ship that brought him to Earth isn't always present, with some versions of the character, like the one featured in the 1990s animated show and the live-action Lois and Clark rom-com from the same era, showing that Superman can reflect his heat vision off a regular old mirror. For anyone curious about how Superman is able to so deftly laser the stubble off his face without either injury or cutting a hole through his bathroom wall, a detail about Superman's heat vision that isn't often showcased is that technically it can encompass Superman's entire field of vision, and that he has to consciously will it to affect a smaller area. Thus, not unlike many a male's prodigious skill directing water from a hose to an exact target despite rarely actually handling hoses for such a task, years of directing his heat vision have given Superman supreme unerring control over this power to the point that in one comic he gave someone a lobotomy by firing a micron-thick laser through their eyes. Also, a detail that's consistent throughout portrayals of Superman's shaving method is that he has to be very careful to avoid injuries, suggesting that for the record, Superman could potentially hurt himself with his own heat vision if he wasn't careful. As such, it's now our personal canon that could Superman fire a heat ray so powerful it could hurt Superman is the DC equivalent of asking if God could create a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it. But let's move on from there and talk about some bonus facts, shall we? And we begin, of course, with the Superdong. According to some individuals that dare not speak their names working on live-action Superman projects, one of the biggest behind-the-scenes arguments when designing the Man of Steel's costume is how big the codpiece should be, with some arguing that Superman should have a fittingly supersized member and thus a massive codpiece, and others arguing that even if Superman had a super penis, he'd have the modesty to cover it, and thus the codpiece should be smaller and more conservative. Invariably, the latter camp wins out due to Superman's status as a family-friendly hero. That said, there have been examples of the actor playing Superman being too well endowed to comfortably fit into the more modest and streamlined costume designed for them. Towards this end, there's a persistent rumor a portion of the CGI budget for Superman Returns had to go into smoothing out Brandon Routh's obvious bulge. Likewise, for the 2005 Superman movie, there have been rumors that the size of David Corenswet's Corenswet was causing costuming issues. For some reason, the studios behind each movie have refused to comment on either of these things, which, come on, executives, there would be no better way to advertise. The headlines there, they write themselves, and if this didn't bring in the mass female audience to a superhero movie, well, nothing would. And speaking of Superman Super Dong, according to most versions of the character, Superman does indeed possess one, and it works as you would expect, with Superman being fully capable of fathering children, though in some stories, Kryptonian and Terran DNA are said to be incompatible. Again, comics don't often delve into the mechanics of super baby making, but it can be assumed that Superman is able to consummate the act the same way he's able to bump into people without sending them through a brick wall, by concentrating and deliberately suppressing his own super strength, which, as noted, is lucky for poor Lois's uterus, though does little to explain how Super Fetus doesn't kick through her insides like a birthing xenomorph. In regards to limiting his own strength, in some comics it's established that Superman places mental blocks on himself to feel normal, and that when doing so, he has roughly the strength of an average man his size. According to Superman, he does this so that he can relax and not cause an earthquake by shrugging or vast devastation when he sneezes. Further, in some comics, to explain why Superman doesn't detonate people's lungs and eardrums whilst flying about the city, it's said that he's learned a special way of moving his molecules that allows him to break the sound barrier without causing a sonic boom. This technique was said to be taught to him by the Flash. Going back to Superman's nether regions and the quirk of wearing his underwear on the outside, while there have been many fantastical proposed origins of this seemingly odd modish style, our favourite of which being that most superheroes lost their parents at an early age, so they had no one to tell them that the underwear goes under your clothes, the true origin of the practice is pretty simple. According to the aforementioned Julius Schwartz, this was simply modelled after the garb of aerial circus performers and wrestlers of the era in which the first superheroes like Superman proudly donned their underpants over their tights. Now, it should be noted here that the wrestlers, circus performers, and superheroes weren't actually wearing underwear, but rather tight underwear-like shorts over their leggings. As superheroes are generally incredibly gifted athletically and perform amazing acrobatic stunts while crime fighting, it was natural enough for this style of dress to get adopted by the earliest superhero artists for their characters. Two of the earliest major representations of this could be found in Flash Gordon 1934, which in turn was partially the inspiration for the garb of Superman in 1938, with the principal difference being the colors of their uniforms and the fact that Superman had a cape, as far as we can find, the first major superhero to wear one. And of course, if you still want to think of the superhero tight shorts as underwear, given that Superman and others often wear their uniform under their normal clothes, kind of makes sense. And thanks for watching.